While caregivers from other countries may get residency sooner than expected, this week the immigration minister introduced a program that will give caregivers from abroad permanent Canadian residency status upon arrival. Now, the program is expected to help address the demand for caregivers in this country, but also protect new arrivals from abuses once they arrive. It's a matter I talked about with the immigration minister earlier this week. Well, joining us right now is the Minister for Immigration, Marc Miller. Minister, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Listen, let's begin here with the caregivers, because what you're proposing is an immediate path to permanent residency. This is instead of 12 months of Canadian work experience. What's driving the change? Why are you prioritizing this?
Well, first, I think it fundamentally makes sense. These are people that come to Canada to take care of the people we prize the most, our older generations and the very young. And often they've been in very precarious positions for 12, 24 months, often beholden to one employer. And on the margins, there's been exploitation. And I think that's something that has happened throughout the course of this program that has been going on for a couple decades. And Canada expects us to take care of the people that take care of our most important generations. And so I think it made sense as a matter of fairness. Also in that same vein, making sure that the language requirements of those people do not present an additional barrier to permanent residency, where comparable programs in other jurisdictions in Canada require sort of a level 4 language knowledge. This is something that was just smart to do, and I think it was high time. I talked to a number of caregivers and their advocacy groups, and they say they've been fighting for this for 20 years, so it's a good thing to do. And given the current numbers and requirements of people to provide care with an aging population, this is something I think we needed to act on.
Okay, so a need in terms of the population base here in Canada, but you used the word exploitation, Minister. What kind of stories were you hearing about that was concerning to you?
Well, I'd say first and foremost, work conditions, abusive behavior, clearly people and the impact that this has had on folks' mental health. We're often, let's not hide the fact that we're often talking about people from the Philippines, often women separated from their families. So that longer period where they're separated from their families, taking that difficult decision to go into a country like Canada where they're expected to be treated fairly, that sort of all added up to something that needed to be done as a matter of principle, but also as a matter of practice for a group of people that are vulnerable in their employment situation.
And to be clear, by giving them permanent status right away, it gives them the freedom to pursue another employer if one is being abusive, also gives them more ability to travel in and out of the country?
Sure, yeah. Although let's be clear also, there are a number of caregivers that are permanent residents, and they choose to do so. It just was one of the factors that contributed to people not being treated as fairly as they should be.
Okay, now will there be a cap on this? Will there be a ceiling for a number that you're willing to distribute every year?
Yeah, so there's always within these pilot projects, and we do intend to make this permanent over time, there are caps, so it is not an unlimited number of people.
Okay. Now, how will you know that the caregivers who do come will meet professional requirements? Because, you know, in the current setup, and I hear what you're saying about trying to prevent abuse, but, you know, in the current setup with 12 months, that does give an employer or some type of Canadian entity to assess whether or not the caregiver meets the requirements that are needed in this country.
Yeah, I mean, they still have to, when coming here, fulfill the criteria, and that's clear from the get-go. You know, these 12 or 24-month periods of temporary residency were not necessarily intended to be a dry run of people. People had to have the qualifications by coming here, and people do still have the luxury of dismissing people. That isn't being questioned here. This is about people's permanent residency, the option that they've been fighting for, that advocacy groups have been fighting for so long, to make this program more permanent as a matter of equity and fairness to caregivers.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's only a few weeks left in Parliament before the summer break. When do you expect this to actually be enacted and being able to start?
So the program does launch any time at the latest early 2025 to late 2024. We do have the unique situation of having a backlog of caregivers under the current programs that are expiring, so there'll be some transitional measures that we'll need to address. But that's sort of the timeline that we're looking at.
Okay. Now, before we're done here, I also want to talk to you about the situation in Gaza, because you did last week increase the number of Gaza reunification eligibility in terms of a program. You raised that cap to 5,000 applicants. Has anyone actually made it to Canada via that program yet?
We have had a number of landings. We certainly, in Canada, it's something we're monitoring quite closely, Michael. As an indicative measure, we have, I would say, and I have to check the latest numbers, but under this program or just more humanitarian envelopes, about 500 visas that have been issued to folks in Cairo that are then moving on to their families that are sponsoring them in Canada. That number of people in Canada is less than 500 to the best of my knowledge. But we are constantly monitoring the people coming to Canada and their process of reunification.
Monitoring, but are you helping to get them out of Gaza, given, of course, the situation on the ground? I'm wondering just what Canadian Global Affairs is doing to help people get out.
We continue, Michael, our diplomatic efforts, whether it's Global Affairs or Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, through diplomatic means to advocate first and foremost for a ceasefire and release of hostages. That is the best way to open up the borders, which have been currently closed since May 7th. Up to now, people have had to take matters into their own hands and often have to pay bribes to get through Rafah border, which is unacceptable. Again, we're doing all we can in circumstances where we do not control everything going on, indeed very little going on at Rafah gates, and we don't have the direct influence to be able to extract people. So we have to use our diplomatic equity and continue to advocate for people to be treated safely and for people under this program to be eligible for transition into Canada through Cairo. We had, just before operations began most recently in Rafah by the Israeli Minister of Defense, had a breakthrough in the program, in particular where they were going to assist in that departure, but obviously events superseded that.
Quickly running out of time, but I do want to ask you one question, and I appreciate it's not your portfolio, but of course NSICOP did issue a report earlier this week. We heard Michael Chong in the House of Commons today pushing your government to release the names of MPs who may have helped foreign entities. I'm wondering what your position is on that, because it seems to be that your government does not want to release the names at this point.
I don't think it's a question of want, Michael, and let's recall that this is a body who produced this report that exists because our government put it into place. It's very important, and they are sworn to secrecy. It may surprise some, but I'm not privy to that information, so very hard to speculate without having myself being privy to that information.
Okay. Well, Minister Miller, I always appreciate the time, and thank you for this evening.
Thank you.